You're listening to the Bare Metal Cyber Prepcast, created to help you succeed in your educational journey. Learn more at baremetalcyber.com, where additional prepcasts, books, and training materials await. Let's get started. Involving stakeholders from the very beginning of a project is one of the strongest levers for reducing risk and increasing adoption. Too often, stakeholders are engaged late in the process, when most of the investment has already been committed and options for adjustment are limited. Early, continuous involvement flips this pattern by anchoring alignment at the start and sustaining it throughout delivery. When stakeholders contribute from day one, assumptions are surfaced quickly, requirements gain fidelity, and ownership of outcomes becomes shared rather than unilateral. Consider how much rework can be avoided when users validate early prototypes instead of reacting to finished features. Inclusion is not about formality, it is about partnership. Stakeholders engaged early learn alongside the team, shaping the journey as it unfolds. This accelerates discovery, prevents late-stage surprises, and creates solutions that reflect genuine needs rather than imagined ones. Stakeholder identification and mapping ensures that no critical voice is absent from the conversation. A map should include primary users who interact directly with the product, customers who fund or purchase it, sponsors who set direction, compliance partners who manage risks, support teams who handle issues, and neighboring groups affected by change. Without such mapping, it is easy to overrepresent the loudest stakeholders and overlook quieter but equally critical ones. For example, designing a healthcare application without including compliance officers may result in legal setbacks, no matter how well the user interface performs. A systematic approach to mapping gives teams a full picture of influence and impact. This reduces blind spots and ensures solutions reflect the entire ecosystem they touch. By clarifying who matters and why, mapping strengthens inclusion and keeps projects connected to real-world complexity. Role clarity and decision rights protect teams from the churn of hidden vetoes or unclear authority. By documenting who provides input, who makes final decisions, and who is accountable for outcomes, teams avoid ambiguity that slows progress. For instance, a sponsor might set overall business objectives, while product owners make day-to-day trade-offs, and compliance partners confirm risk boundaries. Without clarity, disagreements linger unresolved, and progress halts when unexpected vetoes appear. Explicit decision rights do not eliminate conflict, but they channel it to the right forums and timelines. Stakeholders gain confidence when they know their role. Some contribute insights, others approve scope, while others execute. A culture of inclusion thrives when authority is transparent rather than implicit. This clarity speeds decision-making and reduces the friction of misaligned expectations. Access and cadence agreements sustain involvement without exhausting stakeholders. These agreements specify predictable touchpoints, such as discovery workshops, sprint reviews, or monthly roadmap checks, so participation is timely and efficient. Busy stakeholders are more likely to contribute when the rhythm is clear and the ask is specific. For example, a legal partner might commit to attending a quarterly compliance review, with additional check-ins only when high-risk items arise. Without cadence agreements, teams fall into the trap of chasing stakeholders reactively, creating delay and frustration. Structured access builds trust because it respects time, while ensuring input is not forgotten. For stakeholders, predictability lowers barriers to involvement. For teams, cadence creates continuity of insight. Agreements transform engagement from ad hoc interruptions into smooth, dependable collaboration. Aligning success criteria early captures what value actually means in context. Stakeholders bring diverse perspectives on outcomes, guardrails, and non-functional needs, such as performance, security, or accessibility. Documenting these criteria up front provides a stable anchor for scope and decision-making. For example, a sponsor may prioritize faster onboarding, while a compliance partner emphasizes data retention limits. Aligning these perspectives prevents conflict later by showing how trade-offs will be evaluated. Success criteria also reduce ambiguity during reviews, as increments can be assessed against shared definitions of progress rather than subjective impressions. Without alignment, teams risk discovering too late that they and their stakeholders were chasing different visions of success. Involvement from day one ensures that the meaning of value is explicit, testable, and co-owned by everyone at the table. Co-creation practices transform stakeholders from reviewers into partners. Instead of simply reacting to finished proposals, stakeholders collaborate in framing problems, splitting stories, and shaping acceptance criteria. This practice builds adoption by embedding stakeholder fingerprints into the product. For instance, involving support staff in splitting stories ensures that usability reflects operational realities, reducing future burden. Co-creation deepens ownership. Stakeholders see their contributions reflected in delivered outcomes, which increases buy-in. Beyond adoption, it also improves quality by surfacing constraints or ideas that teams alone might overlook. The principle is simple. When people help build something, they are more likely to support and use it. Co-creation anchors collaboration not in sign-off but in joint authorship of solutions, strengthening both trust and effectiveness. Representativeness safeguards ensure that stakeholder inclusion is not skewed toward the most convenient or loudest voices. True representation means including diverse user segments, edge cases, and overlooked perspectives. For example, designing a transit app without including people with accessibility risks excluding a significant user group. Representativeness requires deliberate effort, seeking out voices that might otherwise be absent and weighting their input appropriately. This prevents solutions from overfitting to narrow audiences and missing broader adoption. Safeguards may include quotas for user testing across demographics or checklists for inclusion in feedback sessions. On the exam, representativeness scenarios often test whether candidates can distinguish real inclusion from superficial engagement. The agile response usually emphasizes that inclusion must mirror the diversity of the system it serves. Without safeguards, the loudest voices dominate, and value remains partial. Information radiators provide stakeholders with self-serve visibility into progress, risks, and learning. Dashboards, shared boards, and automated updates replace ad hoc status requests with trustworthy, current signals. For example, a stakeholder might log into a dashboard showing current backlog items, upcoming demos, and open risks, rather than waiting for emailed reports. Radiators reduce latency between reality and awareness, enabling faster alignment. They also reduce burden on teams by making information available without repeated custom updates. For stakeholders, radiators increase confidence by showing unfiltered progress. Without such transparency, stakeholders may feel disconnected, creating tension and mistrust. Information radiators turn inclusion into a continuous stream rather than a series of sporadic reports, building both trust and efficiency. Feedback quality standards ensure that stakeholder input is actionable rather than vague. Input should specify observations, evidence, and traceability to decisions. For example, instead of, "I don't like the design," a stakeholder might provide, "In usability tests, 3 users struggled with navigation. Could we simplify the menu?" Quality standards guide stakeholders in framing their input productively, preventing feedback from becoming personal preference or noise. Traceability links input to decisions, showing how concerns were considered. This fosters transparency and accountability. Even if feedback is not adopted, stakeholders see their input respected. Without standards, feedback risks becoming scattered, contradictory, or superficial, slowing progress. A culture of inclusion teaches stakeholders how to provide feedback that advances outcomes rather than complicating them. Conflict of interest and bias checks are essential to maintaining ethical stakeholder engagement. Stakeholders often bring incentives or constraints that may unintentionally skew input. For example, a vendor might favor solutions that increase their revenue but not necessarily customer value. Bias checks require surfacing these incentives transparently and considering them explicitly during evaluation. This does not mean excluding biased perspectives, but rather contextualizing them. Conflict of interest policies might include disclosure requirements or diverse review panels that balance perspectives. Without such checks, stakeholder engagement risks turning into capture by particular interests. A healthy culture acknowledges that all input carries perspective and manages it openly. Transparency keeps inclusion credible and prevents decisions from being distorted by hidden agendas. Remote and distributed inclusion patterns adapt involvement for global teams. Asynchronous pre-reads, recorded demos, and written feedback channels ensure that stakeholders across time zones participate fully. For example, a stakeholder unable to attend a live demo might watch a recording and provide comments on a shared board. Without these patterns, distributed participants often receive secondary or delayed access, undermining inclusion. Remote practices expand fairness by ensuring geography does not determine influence. They also improve thoughtfulness, as asynchronous formats allow time for reflection. On the exam, distributed inclusion scenarios often test whether candidates can adapt practices for fairness. The agile response usually emphasizes that inclusion must extend across distance. Remote and hybrid participation are not exceptions but integral to sustained stakeholder engagement. Privacy and confidentiality guardrails ensure that stakeholder inclusion respects legal and ethical obligations. Open access must be balanced with duty of care. For example, stakeholders may be given visibility into progress and outcomes, but not into sensitive user data without appropriate controls. Guardrails clarify what information can be shared, with whom, and through which channels. They also protect against unintentional disclosure, ensuring compliance with data protection regulations. Without guardrails, inclusion risks exposing confidential information, creating liability and mistrust. Stakeholders should feel informed, but also secure that boundaries are respected. By embedding confidentiality into inclusion practices, teams demonstrate responsibility, ensuring openness does not compromise trust or compliance. Early risk surfacing uses stakeholder involvement to detect hazards before investment ramps. Stakeholders are invited to flag regulatory, operational, or reputational risks proactively. For example, an operations partner might highlight staffing constraints that would prevent adoption, or a compliance officer may flag emerging regulations. Surfacing risks early allows mitigations to be built into design, preventing costly rework. Stakeholder inclusion is not just about capturing wants. It is about uncovering constraints that affect feasibility and sustainability. Without early surfacing, risks are discovered late, when adjustments are most expensive. Involving stakeholders from day one transforms risk management from reactive firefighting into proactive planning. This reduces surprise, strengthens resilience, and aligns investment with reality. Anti-pattern awareness warns teams against superficial or performative stakeholder inclusion. Common pitfalls include late engagement framed as sign-off only, proxy users substituting for real customers, or reviews that are ceremonial rather than substantive. These patterns create the illusion of involvement while undermining real inclusion. For example, inviting stakeholders only for final approval ensures they cannot shape the outcome, and their feedback becomes disruptive rather than enabling. On the exam, anti-pattern scenarios often test whether candidates can recognize hollow practices. The agile response usually emphasizes that inclusion must be continuous, diverse, and evidence-based. Avoiding anti-patterns ensures stakeholder engagement delivers its promise, aligning expectations, accelerating learning, and preventing costly late-stage surprises. For more cyber-related content and books, please check out cyberauthor.me. Also, there are other prepcasts on cybersecurity and more at baremetalcyber.com. Discovery workshops are one of the most effective ways to begin inclusion, because they create structured opportunities for joint exploration. Instead of teams building assumptions in isolation, workshops bring users, sponsors, compliance partners, and other stakeholders into the same room, physical or virtual, to surface needs, constraints, and options together. For example, A discovery session for a new healthcare product might include clinicians, patients, and legal advisors, producing a shared map of challenges and hypotheses. These workshops establish a common language, align expectations, and generate prioritized assumptions to test. The format signals that stakeholders are not passive reviewers but active participants. Without such early collaboration, projects risk starting on shaky foundations, with hidden conflicts only surfacing later. Discovery workshops are the bridge from intent to reality, ensuring day-one inclusion produces clarity and direction grounded in diverse perspectives. Backlog refinement with stakeholders keeps inclusion continuous rather than episodic. Involving stakeholders in clarifying backlog items ensures that slices of work reflect real needs, not team-only interpretations. For example, a compliance partner might refine acceptance criteria to specify evidence requirements, while a customer representative might prioritize usability features that drive adoption. Refinement is not about stakeholders dictating scope, but about co-owning clarity of value and readiness for flow. By translating feedback into backlog items with explicit acceptance criteria, teams reduce ambiguity and improve predictability. Without such collaboration, backlogs risk becoming internally coherent but externally misaligned, creating friction later. Backlog refinement transforms abstract feedback into actionable, outcome-linked stories, sustaining the thread of stakeholder involvement throughout delivery. Review and demo discipline gives stakeholders direct visibility into working increments, measured against the success criteria agreed at the start. Reviews should focus less on showing progress for approval and more on fact-based discussion of fit, gaps, and next bets. For example, a demo of a new feature should highlight how it aligns with goals like reducing onboarding time, inviting stakeholders to validate outcomes and suggest refinements. This discipline prevents demos from becoming theater or celebrations detached from objectives. Stakeholders who see real increments gain confidence that progress is meaningful and adaptable. Without discipline, reviews drift into checkbox rituals where learning is minimal. Demo sessions must remain spaces where alignment is tested honestly, reinforcing trust and guiding continuous adaptation. Qualitative and quantitative signal fusion strengthens decisions by combining stories with data. Stakeholders bring narrative evidence from interviews, support tickets, or user observations, while telemetry and analytics provide quantitative insights. For instance, users may describe confusion about a navigation menu, and clickstream data may confirm high drop-off rates at the same point. Fusion prevents over-reliance on anecdotes or raw numbers alone, producing balanced insight. Without combining signals, organizations risk privileging whichever voice is loudest or whichever metric is most convenient. Inclusion thrives when decisions are anchored in both lived experiences and hard data. Stakeholder culture grows stronger when every voice is paired with measurable patterns, ensuring that outcomes reflect reality from multiple angles rather than one-dimensional views. Decision logs anchor transparency by recording stakeholder perspectives, the options considered, and the rationale for final choices. Logs also capture trade-offs, showing how constraints shaped outcomes. For example, a log might explain that a performance feature was deprioritized in favor of compliance needs, with stakeholder feedback noted on both sides. This record reassures stakeholders that their input was heard and considered, even when not adopted. Decision logs also prevent relitigation, saving time in future cycles. Without them, stakeholders may feel their input disappears into a void, undermining trust. Logs turn inclusion into a traceable process, providing accountability for both teams and stakeholders. In doing so, they transform feedback from ephemeral comments into institutional knowledge that guides future alignment and learning. Escalation and tie-break protocols prevent disagreements from stalling progress. When stakeholders hold differing views, escalation paths clarify when and how disputes should be elevated, what evidence is required, and how timing interacts with release plans. For example, a conflict between usability and security requirements might escalate to a governance forum where trade-offs are adjudicated. Protocols also ensure transparency, preventing hidden vetoes or back-channel decisions. Without escalation clarity, teams risk paralysis or resentment. Inclusion requires both openness and discipline. Everyone's voice matters, but decisions cannot remain unresolved indefinitely. Protocols preserve fairness and speed by clarifying how to handle irreconcilable input. They demonstrate that dissent is valued but must ultimately be integrated into accountable decision-making. Dependency and interface coordination brings upstream and downstream stakeholders into integration planning early. For example, a new feature depending on an external data feed must involve the data provider from the outset to avoid last-minute incompatibilities. Interface coordination ensures that handoffs between teams or vendors are transparent, with clear sequencing and responsibilities. Without such involvement, integration often becomes the graveyard of assumptions, where hidden dependencies emerge too late. Stakeholder inclusion is not just about end users. It is also about the technical and operational partners who ensure systems fit together. By involving these neighbors early, teams reduce surprises, smooth flow, and improve delivery reliability. Inclusion at boundaries is just as critical as inclusion at the center. Compliance by design participation ensures that risk, legal, and safety partners contribute from the start rather than auditing only at the end. Embedding these stakeholders in backlog refinement and definitions of done allows evidence to accrue continuously. For example, compliance requirements might be integrated as acceptance criteria, with audit trails generated automatically during development. This prevents the costly stop and start of late compliance reviews and ensures agility coexists with accountability. Without compliance by design, organizations risk delay, rework, or worse, non-compliance. Inclusion here is not optional, it is essential for trustworthiness. Involving compliance partners as collaborators rather than gatekeepers shifts the relationship from adversarial to cooperative, reinforcing the principle that inclusion safeguards both agility and integrity. Vendor and partner alignment extends stakeholder inclusion across organizational boundaries. External actors must adapt to iterative rhythms, participating in review cadences and co-creation sessions. For example, a vendor delivering components should demo increments alongside internal teams, ensuring fit and integration. Contracts may need to be adapted to reflect iterative milestones rather than single final deliveries. Without alignment, external contributions become sources of friction and delay. Inclusion must encompass all contributors to value, not just those within the organization. By aligning vendors and partners to the same rhythms, organizations build ecosystems where collaboration is seamless. This external dimension of inclusion prevents late surprises and creates stronger partnerships anchored in shared accountability for outcomes. Inclusion metrics provide evidence that practices are working. Measures might include participation equity across stakeholder groups, latency from feedback to decision, acceptance rates of delivered increments, and rework due to late changes. For example, if most late-stage rework stems from absent stakeholders during early discovery, metrics will reveal the gap. Metrics ensure that inclusion remains purposeful rather than symbolic. Without them, organizations may mistake activity for impact. Inclusion is successful not because stakeholders attended meetings, but because their input improved alignment, reduced rework, and accelerated value. Measuring these outcomes ensures continuous improvement of engagement practices. Inclusion becomes a system of accountability, not just an aspiration. Stakeholder fatigue is a real risk if involvement feels endless or unproductive. Managing fatigue requires concise artifacts, clear asks, and rotating participation. For example, instead of inviting all stakeholders to every review, a rotating schedule may involve specific groups depending on the topics at hand. Concise updates and focused questions reduce cognitive load, showing respect for busy schedules. Without such care, even well-intentioned inclusion can become overwhelming, leading stakeholders to disengage. Sustainable inclusion balances thoroughness with efficiency. By keeping interactions purposeful and manageable, teams protect energy while preserving the benefits of continuous engagement. Stakeholders are more willing to stay engaged when they feel their time is valued. Learning repositories ensure that stakeholder contributions compound over time. By storing decisions, experiments, and outcomes in searchable form, organizations prevent knowledge from disappearing after each cycle. For example, a repository may document how stakeholder feedback led to a particular design choice, creating context for future teams. Without repositories, lessons must be relearned, and stakeholders may feel their insights vanish. Inclusion grows stronger when input is preserved and accessible, making it part of institutional memory. Repositories turn one-off contributions into ongoing assets, building continuity across projects. This practice demonstrates respect for stakeholder investment and strengthens trust by showing that input is valued long after the meeting ends. Continuous improvement of inclusion practices ensures they remain relevant as context shifts. Periodic meta-reviews examine engagement quality, pruning noise, closing participation gaps, and refreshing agreements. For example, if remote stakeholders report difficulty contributing, practices may be updated to emphasize asynchronous input. Without review, inclusion risks becoming ritualistic, with diminishing impact. Continuous improvement acknowledges that inclusion itself is a practice subject to learning. By refining cadence, forums, and methods, organizations sustain genuine collaboration. On the exam, improvement scenarios often test whether candidates can connect inclusion to adaptability. The agile response usually emphasizes that inclusion evolves alongside products and teams, ensuring it continues to serve outcomes effectively. Defining success for stakeholder inclusion provides closure and validation. Success is measured not by attendance or artifacts but by faster time to validated value, fewer late surprises, and higher adoption rates. For example, if stakeholder involvement leads to early detection of usability issues and quicker delivery of market-ready features, inclusion is succeeding. Adoption and satisfaction are the ultimate evidence that inclusion pays off. Without such definitions, inclusion risks being treated as symbolic. Success must be grounded in tangible outcomes that show the value of engagement. In practice, effective inclusion delivers smoother flow, better fit, and greater trust. On the exam, scenarios often test whether candidates can connect inclusion to measurable outcomes. True success means stakeholders see themselves in the product, and the product succeeds in the world. In conclusion, stakeholder inclusion is not a one-off event, but a continuous practice that begins on day one and endures through delivery. It depends on mapping participants, clarifying roles, and sustaining predictable rhythms of involvement. Practices like discovery workshops, backlog refinement, and demos convert inclusion into actionable alignment. Risk surfacing, compliance by design, and vendor participation extend involvement into all dimensions of delivery. Metrics, fatigue management, and repositories ensure that inclusion remains sustainable and impactful. On the exam, candidates will be tested on their ability to recognize practices that turn rhetorical involvement into real collaboration. In practice, inclusion is the mechanism that transforms diverse perspectives into shared value, reducing rework, accelerating learning, and strengthening adoption. Thanks for tuning in to the Bare Metal Cyber Prepcast, your trusted source for cybersecurity news and insights. Remember to subscribe at baremetalcyber.com so you never miss an update. And visit cyberauthor.me for best-selling cybersecurity books that equip you with expert knowledge. Until next time, stay secure and stay vigilant.